Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this microfiche time capsule, we are looking at the Ladies' Home Journal from October 1901. And this article is entitled, Some Things the President Does Not Do, by John Elfreth Watkins, Jr. I thought that would be really interesting, and I am willing to bet that the rules are different today compared to how they were in 1901. So this is a 1901 article, so I thought it would be fun to read it and then compare it to what the rules are for the president today. I'll bet they are vastly different. I know that a lot of rules changed following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in the 60s. So this was long before that. Long before that. So let's take a look. A president of the United States is the only law-abiding and reason-possessing citizen thereof whom custom holds as a prisoner within limited bounds. In how he spends his leisure time, he is more restricted than the colored janitor who daily empties his wastebasket. Wow, that's extraordinarily racist. I'm speechless. Okay, moving on. I'm sorry, the past was so racist. Okay. That the man at the head of any great institution, public or private, should consult his personal taste as to his whereabouts in vacation times or as to any enjoyment outside office hours, less than the humblest menial employed under him, would at once appear as a paradox. Okay, also racist. I'm sorry. Why did they have to specifically say that the man was a person of color? Like, oh my gosh. I'm sorry, but this is also classist. This is also like, if you're a janitor, you're a bad person. Well, that's not true. Anyway, or as to any enjoyment outside office history, less than the humblest menial employed under him, would at once appear as a paradox. I am not a fan of this introduction. Holy cow. Okay, moving on. Through the precedent, such a paradoxical condition has come to exist in the executive branch of our government. The president must not leave the country, even for a day. Yeah, that's not true today. This is an old unwritten law which has been respected by all successors of George Washington, with perhaps one or two exceptions. Many people, otherwise well informed, have the notion that this restriction is imposed by statute. Such is not the case. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's not true today because I do happen to know that the President of the United States in our day has visited many countries. Like, we have pictures and video of him. So far it's only been men. Hopefully in the future that will change. But visiting different countries such as a visit to China, visit to Russia, visit to Korea, visit to Japan. I'm thinking of mostly Asian, but also Europe, visit to Great Britain, visit to Germany, visit to Italy, they visit all over the world. I know that they've also made some kind of relatively token appearances at natural disasters, things of that nature in other countries. So I do know that that is something that is done. It's not allowed. But I can understand why it was frowned upon back then, since the security of the chief executive would be very difficult to ensure in those times. All right. Technically, two have left the country. President McKinley emphasized his respect for his rule last spring. Before his departure upon his tour to the South and West, it was unofficially announced that he would meet President Diaz of Mexico, somewhere near the border of that sister republic. A controversy as to whether Mr. McKinley might properly cross the Mexican line, even for a few hours, arose. Early in May, when he visited El Paso, Texas, where he was greeted by President Diaz's personal representative, he expressed a desire to take a look into Mexico. From El Paso, there extends into Mexico the International Bridge spanning the Rio Grande. Whether the president would dare to cross this structure or not was the question, which members of his party asked one another. He did not. He went to the bridge and caught a view of the Sierra Madre. Halfway across the bridge was a line. Stepping over it was putting a foot upon Mexican territory. President Harrison had ventured as far as this line 10 years before, but President McKinley did not so much as place his foot upon the bridge. Then why did they mention it? Okay, President Arthur, Chester A. Arthur, was accused of violating this unwritten law. In October 1883, he went upon a pleasure trip to Alexandria Bay, Thousand Islands. His political enemies accused him then of venturing across the Canadian line while on a fishing excursion. The boundary between Canada and New York extends to the middle of the St. Lawrence River. President Cleveland was similarly accused. On one of his hunting trips to North Carolina, he sailed by the ocean route past Cape Hatteras. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. His enemies contended that he ventured outside the 3-mile limit. According to international law, a country's possessions extended for 3 miles outside its coastline. Plying the seas farther than this is leaving home territory. Who cares? I'm sorry, but so he went on to international waters. Yeah, I don't care. Yeah, that's really weird that they made such a big deal out of it. Okay, I was going to do this afterwards, but now it looks like I'm going to have to look it up right now. So I'm curious as to when this changed, because I know that presidents leave the country all the time now. So when were presidents of the United States allowed to leave the country? Alright, there's our whole Wikipedia article on it. List of international trips made by presidents of the United States. Early 20th century trips. Franklin D. Roosevelt. I'm going to skip down and just look like a history, but it looks like lots of people have. Alright, I'm just going to have to start at the top, I think. Okay, international trips made by presidents of the United States have become a valuable part of the United States' interactions with foreign nations. Such trips were first made in the early 20th century. That's interesting. So this article is written before they started, yeah? Traveling abroad is one of the many duties of the President of the United States, leading the nation's diplomatic efforts through state visits, private meetings with foreign leaders, or attending international summits. These are complicated undertakings that require months of planning along with a great deal of coordination and communication. Makes sense to me. In the 19th century, American Social Convention made international travel by the incumbent president taboo, though foreign travel by former presidents was acceptable. The most widely publicized trip of this nature was the 1877-79 World Tour of Ulysses S. Grant. Domestic travel was regarded as a welcome opportunity for presidents to talk with people who had elected them, but foreign travel was seen as in an altogether different light. The general public did not want their president mingling with royalty, visiting grand palaces, or exchanging bows with kings and queens. This taboo was broken in the early 20th century as policymakers at the federal level began to reevaluate the nation's role in international affairs. The first international presidential trip, Theodore Roosevelt's 1906 visit to Panama, signaled a new era in how presidents conducted diplomatic relations in other countries. Roosevelt's 4 immediate successors made at least one international trip while in office, cementing the acceptability of presidential global travel. So this article is wrong, yeah. It looks like there was a Ulysses S. Grant made a world tour, yeah, and Theodore Roosevelt, well, he wasn't president yet, but like he said that his 4 immediate successors. Okay, never mind. I was thinking the previous ones. Okay, so it looks like Theodore Roosevelt was the first one to leave the country and have it become more socially acceptable. Interesting. Like, that is a solid cultural shift. I was not aware of this, so I find that very fascinating. The presidents were not allowed to leave the country. I mean, that's a little strange. I'm going to skip down and look. Franklin D. Roosevelt made 20 international trips during his presidency. His early travels were by ship, frequently for fishing vacations to the Bahama Banks, Canadian Maritimes, or Newfoundland Island. Yeah. In 1943, he became the first incumbent president to fly by airplane across the Atlantic Ocean during his secret mission to Casablanca. As a result of this trip, he also became the first president to visit North Africa while in office. Makes sense to me. Harry S. Truman made 5 international trips. Dwight D. Eisenhower made 16. John F. Kennedy, 8. Lyndon B. Johnson, 11. Richard Nixon, 15. Gerald Ford, 7. Jimmy Carter, 12. Ronald Reagan, 25. George H.W. Bush, 26. Bill Clinton, 54. George W. Bush, 49. Barack Obama, 52. Donald Trump, 19. Joe Biden, 10 so far. That's really interesting. So I am fascinated by that. That's really fascinating. Okay. Wow. Okay. Looks like they spend a lot of time in Canada, Mexico, France, Great Britain, Germany, and Italy. Those are like the most traveled 2 countries, it looks like. Oh, there's a couple in the Caribbean and like Northern South America. I can't tell which country that is though. Not at a glance. But yeah, interesting. I found that fascinating. Okay, moving on. So that is interesting. So right now that this article was written, there was kind of a cultural shift going on. And in the future of after this article, like only a few years later, it completely changed. That's interesting that they considered that an unspoken rule or unwritten rule. I guess not unspoken since they, are talking about it now, but like it's not written down in like a rule book. That is fascinating to me. So this is an actual shift, and we are watching history change in this article. Fascinating. Okay. When the vice president may rule, this rule does not apply to any other official of the United States. One vice president went so far as to be inaugurated on foreign soil. This was William Rufus King. Who the flip is that? Okay. I have to admit I am not as familiar with the vice presidents as I am with the actual presidents, so my bad. Vice president. On the January before his inauguration, he had gone to Cuba for his health. He took his oath of office before the United States Consul General at Havana. Interesting. In this case, however, it was deemed advisable to pass through Congress a special act permitting the oath taking on alien soil. I guess it's okay. But had he desired to visit Cuba immediately after his installation, he might have done so without such legislation. Yeah, okay. So the vice president was apparently allowed to travel, yeah? Kings, queens, and presidents of foreign states are generally unrestricted by such rules, written or unwritten. Several reigning monarchs visited England to attend Queen Victoria's funeral. The Queen herself traveled extensively in France and was not loath to venture into other countries. King Edward VII recently visited his invalid sister in Germany. The President of Mexico for a while contemplated a visit to the Pan American Exposition, and he might have done so with propriety had he seen fit. Our presidents cannot delegate their power to anyone, not even to their vice presidents, in case of the removal of the president from office, or of his death, resignation, or inability. Only can his duties devolve upon the vice president. A desire for pleasure or rest could not be interpreted as inability to serve the nation. Congress has never prescribed how this inability mentioned in the Constitution should be determined. While President Garfield lay ill, a controversy arose as to whether the vice president should assume the functions of acting president. This General Arthur refused to do so long as the president retained a spark of life. Some high authorities interpreted this inability clause of the Constitution to refer solely to permanent disablement. During his 6th week upon his deathbed, Mr. Garfield affixed his signature to a state paper. Yeah, well, I actually consider that inability. I mean, if you're so sick that you can't leave your bed and you're not really cognitively there, then, I mean, that sounds like inability to me. I don't see any reason why the vice president shouldn't become acting president in such a situation. Just saying. An unwritten rule forbidding foreign travel by the president will doubtless be made a dead letter by fast improving conditions of transit. Really? We just talked about that. That's hilarious. Okay, I'm going to read it again in case you missed that. The unwritten rule forbidding foreign travel by the president will doubtless be made a dead letter by fast improving conditions of transit. In the days of early presidents where there were no railroads, steamboats, telephone or telegraph lines, an exit from this country necessarily entailed dangers, hardships, and serious delays, which meant months when reckoning from the seat of government. But today, a president might travel through Central and South America or Canada equipped with a veritable executive mansion on wheels, and might transact his official business en route without neglecting any of the details of his official routine. Yeah, that's probably why it changed shortly after this, yeah? With the perfection of wireless telegraphy and telephones, it will, before long, be possible for him to so travel by sea and always keep in touch with public affairs. Thus would he command the ship of state, in the literal sense of the word. Once in the old world, even today, he might successfully perform his duties by aid of the cable. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that the invention of the telephone was really what made the difference, yeah? That he was able to keep in touch with all of what was going on. They had kind of teleconferences, yeah? Interesting. Okay. Cannot enter some Washington houses. The president must not enter any foreign embassy or legation. This is another unwritten law. The official residence of an ambassador or minister accredited to Washington is foreign territory, technically, if rented, but actually if owned by its government. Our laws have no hold upon diplomats or their attachés detailed here. Their abodes enjoy immunity from our legal processes. 7 foreign countries own their embassies or legislations in Washington. The patches of land upon which they are built are exempt from taxation. To all intents and purposes, they are foreign colonies, although none is more extensive than an acre or two. France lately purchased an open tract of land on the outskirts of the capital for the purpose of building a legation, yeah? For the purposes of building a legation thereupon. The boundaries of this lot are lines over which it would be deemed improper for the president to step. Another reason for this rule forbidding the presidential presence at a foreign diplomat's abode is founded upon the apprehension that his acceptance of such hospitality might make him indebted to his host. A prudent judge would not accept hospitality from rival attorneys conducting a case before him. President Arthur was accused of breaking this rule also. He was said to have been a frequent visitor at the German legation, with whose minister he was upon warm terms socially. But had it been proven and brought to an issue that he had so strayed from the presidential confines, limiting his predecessors, he could not have been impeached for his action. Okay, let me read that again. But had it been proven and brought to an issue, okay, because it's an unwritten rule, yes. So this is something that presidents don't do, but it's something that presidents could theoretically do if they really wanted to. So they can't be impeached for this action, since it's not a written rule. Okay, I can see that. Let's see if it's similar today. How do I ask this question? Are presidents of the U.S. allowed to visit embassies? I'm not finding the answer. I think that this is something that is not a real rule. Yeah? So I'm not finding that mentioned anywhere online. I mean, not in the first few sites that I looked at. So it makes me think that that's not a rule. But they did mention that it's not a rule. So I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Is it still a tradition? Is it no longer a tradition? I have no idea. All right. The president's formal calls must be few. Oh, that was such a thing back then, wasn't it? It was like, I have to make calls where it was like visiting people, and because there were no telephones or very few, then you had to like physically go over to people's houses and just see if they were home. And if they weren't home, you'd leave a card that you had been there. Yeah? Like that was a thing back then. Like today people do different things, you know. But interesting that was still like a thing in 1901. It is considered improper for the chief executive to go aboard a foreign warship. Okay, even when anchored in our harbors and when flying the colors of a friendly state. Every nail and splinter of such a vessel is, technically speaking, foreign territory. In the event of a deeply devised plot aimed at us when at least suspecting by a foreign foe, such a trap might easily be laid to abduct our president. Mr. McKinley, for instance, although not a uniformed combatant in the recent war, might properly, under international law, have been taken prisoner by Spain. Oh, okay, yeah, I see the problem. President Arthur is said to have disregarded this rule, as well as the two others mentioned. It was reported that he partook of luncheon aboard a foreign warship anchored at Newport. But as in the other cases, his action was not illegal. Once again, this is a tradition and not a rule. Such a restriction is not imposed upon any foreign ruler or executive so far as is known. It is the fad of Emperor William of Germany to inspect foreign fighting craft. Okay, yeah, he likes to go on board and inspect it. A president of the United States must not make a formal call upon anyone except a president-elect, an ex-president, a president of a foreign state, or a reigning monarch visiting our capital. Really? I don't know if this is true anymore. This is an ancient law laid down in Washington's time. It was held by his social advisors that there could be no impropriety in the president's making or receiving informal visits to or from personal friends at his pleasure, but it was deemed improper for him to make such calls in full ceremonial dress or with a retinue of attendants. The president's pleasure should absolutely decide concerning his attendance at tea parties in a private character, and no gentleman or lady ought ever to complain if he rarely ever attends, was the advice given to the first president. But these ancient rules are little respected by the chief magistrates of these days. So does that mean like going to a party as the president? Like dressed as the president and not just like, Uncle Joe or whatever it is? Is that what they mean? Because that would be an informal visit if it was like Uncle Joe coming. But if Mr. President was invited to, some sort of shindig at, Trump Towers, I'm just saying. I know that he's also former president. And that was specifically listed as ex-president, yeah? As like one of the socially acceptable places he could go. So, let me see. Are presidents of the U.S. allowed to go to parties? I'm going to reword this because this is, all I'm getting is like political party stuff, which makes sense to me, but that's not what I'm looking for. Go to picnics. Apparently a congressional picnic is a thing. So that's all that's coming up. Allowed to visit friends. Ooh, that's actually more interesting. Let's go to this one. This is an article from Reader's Digest called Things No U.S. President is Allowed to Do While in Office. And I think that that's similar enough to this article that we can directly compare some of the things listed. All right, I will read all of these at the end, but I think that would be more interesting after we're done with this article. But specifically visiting friends was not listed, although they did say going out to dinner can be done, but the Secret Service ahead of time will need sufficient notice that they'll be able to secure the restaurant, yeah? So it has to be very well planned. So they can't be spontaneous in their visits of people. Interesting. Okay, we will come back to this article and I will go into it in more detail. But apparently it's not quite that, but it has to be very well planned, yeah? All right, receives only intimate friends on Sundays. For a president to accept an invitation to dinner is an impropriety. And they just said you could go to dinner, yes? This was a rule respected by Washington, Adams, and perhaps by other earlier presidents. Frequent informal calls upon members of the cabinet only were deemed perfectly proper, but later presidents have called upon and dined with whomsoever they have seen fit. Yeah, see, and today as well. But it has to be very carefully planned. For each member of the cabinet formally to entertain the president and his wife at dinner each winter has now become an established social custom. The president must not receive any but intimate friends on Sunday. This was another rule of the early days. Even today, reasonable consideration for the chief executives forbids disturbance of his Sabbath rest, and few officials pay him a Sunday call unless they be upon the most intimate terms with him. The President must not hold his annual state receptions or state dinners during Lent. This rule is still respected, although many recent masters of the White House have been worshippers at churches prescribing no social abstinence during the period between Ash Wednesday and Easter Day. It remains as a relic of the mother country's religious influence upon her early colonies. Washington, as is well known, was a communicant of the Church of England. Yeah, and I understood that there were no Catholics presidents until Kennedy. Yeah, wasn't he famous for being the first Catholic president? Yeah. The president never pays a first call except on the arrival of the head of a foreign state in Washington. When President Dole of Hawaii, I'm sorry, I had to look at it twice because I believe we had a Vice President Dole, did we not? Bob Dole, under Bill Clinton, I'm fairly certain. When President Dole of Hawaii and President Iglesias of Costa Rica visited the capital a few years ago, President McKinley paid the first call upon each. Happily, they were quartered at hotels. Had they been guests at legations, sorry, I don't like that word, of their countries, a social complication might have arisen. Perhaps President McKinley would have seen fit to designate a hotel wherein to pay their first courtesies. When the Princess Aribert of Anhalt, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, visited Washington, she paid the president the first call. She was stopping at the British Embassy and moreover was traveling incognito under the name of Countess of Münsterberg. But even had she been the heir of the British throne, she would have owed the president the first call. A crown prince ranks only as high as our vice president. Okay, yeah. Well, that's extremely classist. That's interesting. So they're like, oh no, you have certain ranks depending on whatever, and, crown prince is a vice president's level. So the president would be the level of the actual king or queen, yeah. Okay, whatever. Is that rank really that important? I don't know. Maybe it is to them. All right. Custom selects his dinner companion. The president must not pay a first call upon the president-elect when the latter comes to Washington for his inauguration. John Adams resented the failure of Jefferson to pay him the required first visit. Adams absented himself from the inauguration of the father of democracy. John Quincy Adams acted similarly when Jackson, his successor, refused to pay him the customary honor. The first call of a president-elect should be returned by his predecessor within an hour. That's very strict. A president must not exercise his personal choice in escorting ladies to his formal dinners. Certain strict rules govern the seating of guests at these functions. At his diplomatic dinner, he must pay the first honor to the wife of the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps. At present, Lady Poncefote? At his Supreme Court dinner, the wife of the Chief Justice. At his Cabinet dinner, the wife of the Vice President. Social rules. Those are so annoying. Okay. He does not make use of the complimentary forms of opening and closing official letters. He commences such communications with Sir, not Dear Sir. He simply signs his name in closing. In his correspondence with foreign monarchs, however, he begins his letters with the salutation, Great and Good Friend, and ends them with Your Good Friend. He does not use his name upon his personal cards, which simply bear two words, The President. Thus, to a certain extent, the head of state loses his identity as a private citizen. The card of one president may suffice for all of his successors. The president does not occupy the left side of the carriage seat. Adherence to this rule is apparent to all who have witnessed inaugurations. Thus, on March 4th, 1897, Mr. Cleveland occupied the right-hand seat of the presidential Victoria on passing from the White House to the Capitol, when he was still president. Returning from the Capitol after Mr. McKinley had taken his oath, the latter, when president, occupied the right-hand seat. Similarly, the chief executive must not occupy other than the seat of honor at any formal dinner. He's not allowed to sit on the left carriage seat. Does that mean the driver? Because I believe the driver sits on the left, yes? I mean, it's true in cars today. The driver is on the left. But I'm wondering if that's the reason, like he's not allowed to be the driver, or is it just that like in the back seat he has to sit on the right? And I'm not sure why that would be. But I don't think that's a rule today. When you think of John F. Kennedy's, like very famous, when he was assassinated, he was sitting on the left beside Jackie Kennedy, who was on his right. Yes? So, yeah, like, I don't know. I think that's interesting. The president accepts no valuable gifts. Oh, I know that this is still a rule. This is an actual written rule. Yeah, because I believe Donald Trump got in trouble for that. Yes? Like, I know that they definitely brought him to court for it. I don't know if he ever actually had to pay a fine or anything for it, but I know that this was a big deal at that point. He must not accept gifts of great value from inferiors in the federal service. Thus, when President McKinley received from the President of France 2 handsome Royal Sèvres vases, it was considered proper for him to accept them. Yeah, but that's not of great value. Yeah, that's relatively low value. I mean, it's greater value than I could afford, but like it's like we're not talking about millions of dollars here, yeah? But within recent years, a president who accepted a seaside cottage, yeah, that's a different thing, yeah, from a cabinet officer and several other subscribers had heaped upon his head considerable abuse. Yeah, that makes sense to me. The chief magistrate in question put an end to the criticism by writing out a check covering the value of the property. There you go. Yeah. Pay for it, and we're good. The president does not allow himself to be quoted in interviews with newspaper correspondents or reporters. That's not true. Oh my gosh. No, reporters are totally allowed to quote the president. Nearly all presidents, however, have made exceptions to this rule, like everyone. No, you're definitely allowed to quote the president. That's interesting. Mr. Cleveland authorized one interview and corrected the copy before it was telegraphed. It is related that during President Tyler's administration, Anne Royale, editor of Paul Pry, a sensational sheet, forced the then chief magistrate into an interview by employing quite unusual means. President Tyler occasionally enjoyed a swim in the Potomac, whose banks were then far from civilization. Anne Royale, strolling by the river, spied the presidential apparel and seated herself thereupon. She would not budge until the irate executive, up to his neck in water, had granted the interview. Reporters, yeah. All presidents have received newspaper men and given them such information as they have deemed proper for publication, on condition that the source should not be mentioned. Presidents themselves have made these rules. Interesting, because that's definitely not the case today, because they have, I guess it's maybe because because they're able to videotape it today, and record the audio. So they can get the exact quote from the president. This is what President, Bush said on that day. And they can quote him very directly and don't have to, wonder what it was he really said. Yeah, it's interesting that they actually were not allowed to quote the president directly. Like, quote unquote, this is what the president said. Maybe it's so that they weren't misquoted. Anyway, I am going to very quickly look at the article, and I will link this in the comments below, so I need to remember to get that linked. The article from Reader's Digest. So Reader's Digest, it says, and this article is called 10 Everyday Things No U.S. President is Allowed to Do While in Office. This was by Sarah Madhouse. And I'm not going to read the whole article because I feel like that would be a infringe of copyright, but we will look at the headlines, yeah? So, number 1, have a normal phone call / video chat with friends. And it's not that they're not allowed to call friends or have video chats with friends, but that it has to be very carefully planned and vetted by the Secret Service. So, this is not a spontaneous thing, yeah? Number 2, go to the movies. They have to bring the film to the White House. And today that's not really an issue, but that means that there is a theater in the White House because they can't actually go to the movies themselves. Go out to dinner, we mentioned that before. Once again, has to be very well vetted by the Secret Service ahead of time. And there's also has to be an official food taster present to make sure the food is safe to eat. That doesn't sound like a fun job to me. Like, maybe some people would like that, but drive. I did know this one. The president is not allowed to drive a car. And I do know that Barack Obama did drive a car while he was in office, but that he wasn't allowed to leave, like, the grounds of the White House. Like, it was to test out a car, like a new kind of car, and he loved it, but that he was not allowed to drive on open road. And yeah, so he has a driver. So that's interesting because they did mention in the article they weren't allowed to sit on the left-hand side of a carriage. So I wonder if that's related, you know. Attend their children's performances or sporting events. Like, are there any exceptions to that? But imagine having children and not being able to watch them develop their talents, but that's basically out of the question. That's really sad. Use personal technology unmonitored. So yes, they have a phone, but it's very closely monitored by the powers that be. Use commercial airlines. That makes sense. That's why they have Air Force One, yes? Open the windows. Apparently Michelle Obama mentioned this one. But it's something that most people take for granted, but that in general it's not allowed. I guess it's a security thing. Clean their office. The idea there is that they don't want them to throw away anything that's valuable. Yeah? And nothing, if we're being technical. They're not allowed to do nothing. Okay, so it's like there are things that they're not allowed to do, but that it's not that they're not allowed to do nothing. It's that there's nothing that they're technically not allowed to do. And that is because at the end of the day, the president himself has the final say of what goes on. And the Secret Service is just trying to protect everyone. Anyways, I don't think that was quite 10. I think that was 8. Anyway, it doesn't matter, but it's... I thought that was very interesting that that's the list today. And this was updated February 1st, 2023. So it should be relatively up to date. I found that very interesting. And the rules, I feel like, were more social rules back in the day. Today, they're more safety rules. So I think that there's been a shift there in the sense of the reasons why we do things. So then it was like, it's not proper for a president to XYZ, you know? But today, it's like, it's not safe for a president to do XYZ. And that's the difference, you know? It's a safety question as opposed to a, like, propriety question. And I really appreciate that we have shifted our focus as a society from propriety to safety. I really appreciate that. Like, let's keep ourselves safe, but we don't care as much about what is correct and what is not. Yeah, like we're allowed to do different things if that's what we really want to do. Anyway, I thought that was really fascinating, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you did, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.